You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 29th of August 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up, as President Zelensky prepares to unveil his victory plan to US leaders, just how far have his forces managed to march into Russia? Could Palestine be the latest addition to the BRICS group? Then...
So, we were going to do something, and he asked us not to, so we did not.
We're just having a chat.
Giving you the lane. So take the lane.
Oh, I like your ambition. You can go as hard as on the coast if you like.
Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been caught on a hot mic moment with a US diplomat at the Pacific Islands Forum as he unveils a Pacific Regional Policing Task Force. Plus...
It's a pretty big whoop. It's the Global Security Conference, and it's been one of the premier European security, strategic diplomacy, military conferences for some time.
Monocle's team previews this weekend's GlobeSec conference in Prague. We'll also leaf through the day's papers, get a roundup from the Middle East, and check in on the Venice Film Festival. That's ahead on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. Telegram boss and founder Pavel Durov has been placed under formal investigation in France as part of a probe into organised crime on the messaging app. At least 3 people have been killed in southwestern Japan as Typhoon Shanshan made landfall in Kagoshima Prefecture. And the Paralympic Games kicked off with a spectacular opening ceremony in Paris last night. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. But first, earlier this week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said his troops' incursion into Russia is part of a victory plan he will present to US President Joe Biden next month. Without giving away details, Zelensky admitted it may sound too ambitious for some, but said it was important and would like to show the plan to candidates Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Trump. The move signals a doubling down by Ukraine on its bold counter-invasion of Russia, the largest incursion into the country since the Second World War. Well, I'm joined now by Natalia Gumenyuk, a Ukrainian journalist. Natalia, thank you for joining us. Firstly, what is the latest on this incursion?
Oh, so incursion is going on, and it's really active. I'm talking to you from Kiev, but we're following. So quite a few brigades are taking part, and Ukraine is controlling, hundreds of it's smaller villages, but still. So it's still, Russia still doesn't kind of move very much and redeploy troops, for instance, from the eastern Ukraine, from the Donbass, and the fighting around like Kharkiv are still ongoing, maybe not that active. But in this regard, Ukraine is still moving further. So it's not that they are already at some stable point. It's little by little progressing still.
And in terms of strategic aims, I mean, you've mentioned there the Russians haven't been moving troops from their own invasion to try and counter it. There has been a bit of sluggishness on their part. Is the idea now that Ukraine tries to fortify the position and hold on to it?
So Ukraine wouldn't really, what we understand, of course, Ukraine wouldn't really fortify because the trench war is not something Ukraine is interested in. But they would maneuver. So they probably would move and then, take control over some, let's say, abandoned territory. And still, the longer it's lasts, the more troops later Russia would need to redeploy to at least fortify that territory. That's one thing. Of course, the official version is still the same. This incursion helps Ukrainian territory to be defended in the region of Sumy. So the, glided bombs and all other missiles are not sent. It's cutting the logistic supply lines for Russia, especially on the north. There are some areas of this territory where it's not so critical, but there are some where the bridges are destroyed. And we know that at least at this part of the territory, Russia, won't be able to move further into Ukraine and to wage incursions into northern Ukraine. So there are strategic reasons beyond all the political reasons for showing Ukraine the strengths and for even letting Vladimir Putin stop speaking about, freezing the conflict according to the existing line, because obviously existing line with Ukraine controlling part of the Russian territory isn't something Russia would be interested in.
And it's highly embarrassing for Vladimir Putin. Has that given a morale boost to Ukrainians, or is it quite in its nature, because it's so bold, made people nervous for their loved ones on the front lines?
People are not really nervous, I should say. It's definitely boosted the morale, including inside the troops. That's what I understand kind of clearly, which was really necessary after a long period of this, more or less atrocious war. But it's interesting to follow how also the Kremlin tried to double down what had happened. So if you really follow some official sources and how Russia is still speaking about that as if nothing happens, So I think that they're still not in the point of denial to say what actually had happened.
And in terms of this plan that President Zelensky wants to show US leaders, I mean, is it, as many have suspected, that this play into Russia is to have these bargaining chips, the territory and the captured soldiers? So if they are forced into some kind of negotiation, possibly under a Trump presidency later this year, early next year, that this is something that they can trade off with Russia?
I should explain how the news about the plan was broken. It was actually the regular press conference of President Zelensky when one of the foreign media asked about something like a peace plan. So it sounded as if the president needed to explain that there is a plan. And I'm not saying that there is no any plan, but it's not like he came to the stage with a particular thing to tell. And he explained that there are particular things they're working. I assume they're working constantly. And they want to suggest something which would be suggested to both candidates in the US elections. So there won't be this stop and delay, between somebody is elected and then there is an inauguration. So they want to present something. And of course, this move into Kursk region is really helping Ukraine to be in a stronger position and to have more bargaining chips, probably to a lesser extent the prisoners exchange, which could be dealt separately. It's just very important for Ukraine to return own prisoners of war. But the territorial gain is there, and probably there are other, now the biggest message is, of course, to allow Ukraine to target some of the Russian targets inside of with the British and with the American weapon. So the Russians won't be able to make such strikes as we experienced this week, because to explain what Ukrainians are really want, it's not really. It's really a lot about deterrence, because now it takes 5 seconds for the Russian plane to start to fly and start to send the missiles. So, which is very short period of time to intercept the missile strikes, and there are hundreds of them. And if they would know that they can be reached by the weapon, they probably would move and would fly from the air bases way further. And then there would be minutes and minutes and 40 minutes, half a minute. So Ukraine would have a longer time to intercept the missile strikes. And that probably would decrease the amount of these missile strikes, which we had 236 this Monday, of very serious weapon, extremely serious weapon.
And to combat missiles and drone attacks, Ukraine has been using US-built F-16 fighters, which it campaigned for a long time. But there is a deep division amongst allies. The UK and France are somewhat on board with deeper strikes into Russian territory, but Washington very nervous still on this. Do you think that President Zelensky, he's set to travel to the UN General Assembly next month? Do you think that he's going to win out in the case of getting to use these missiles?
I don't want to sound somebody who's naive, but, it's so much talks about the red lines and escalation and de-escalation, this approach of the US from de-escalation. And how you can call it, like, as I said, like on Monday, we had probably the biggest since the full-scale invasion attack, where 236 different type of missiles were sent on Ukraine, which, Russia used. Ukrainian Forbes magazine counted like $1.2 billion US. That's how this weapon costed for Russia. So, they escalate anyways. So, and the incursion into Kursk region also showed that, what should Ukraine, what should happen? We are there, we are fighting on the Russian soil, which actually also preserving Ukrainian towns. So I think that it should move this idea of, that like we're afraid to escalate, we're afraid that Russia would do something worse. What worse they can do? I think like we should keep the discussion about nuclear strikes totally separate. But in this regard, it can be easily explained how deterrence, how, for instance, the mere presence of F-16 jet, like stop Russians to fly, because they now understand then they can be shut down. So I think if Ukraine would be successful to explain this logic of deterrence, maybe it would happen because, for a long time, it was with every single type of weapon Ukraine was getting, that it needed to explain that it won't be escalation. So I think that if we're living in this logic, it's all the same. So at this stage, it sounds logical already, like to do that and stop these horrible missile strikes.
Natalia Gumenyuk, Ukrainian journalist, thank you very much. This is The Globalist. It's 9:11 in Jerusalem, 7:11 here in London. Now, Russia currently holds the rotating BRICS presidency, the disparate group whose origins actually date back to an acronym in a 2001 Goldman Sachs report, has mulled expansion and formalization for some time. Aspirations for the moment, but a potential new member has emerged. Palestinian ambassador to Russia, Abdel Hafiz Nofal, says Palestine would like to apply to join. To discuss the possibility of this, I'm joined by Michael Binion, foreign affairs specialist for The Times. Michael, thank you for coming on the show. The group has condemned Israel's war and called for an end to war crimes. Member South Africa has, of course, been very active internationally. Could Palestine, though, join them officially, and what would they gain?
Well, they could certainly join if the others would agree to that, although Palestine is not a fully functioning state on its own. Several other countries have already joined this grouping. In January this year, Egypt, the United Arab Emirates, Ethiopia and Iran also joined, and there are many others who are expressing interest about doing so. It would be a political boost for the Palestinians if they were accepted as a full member, and of course it would also give them greater say among a number of important and very large countries in the developing world about the need for full support in their struggle against the Israelis.
So effectively it would send out a pretty strong signal then. How would this affect relations with the US?
Well, the US wouldn't be very pleased with it, and certainly the US already regards the BRICS the BRICS group as a sort of anti-Western grouping, which several countries agree with. I mean, obviously Russia and China see it as an alternative pole to the United States. Other important members, though, India, for example, and Brazil, are less willing to see it as an anti-Western grouping. They just see it as the grouping that will protect the interests of those large countries that have felt somewhat at a disadvantage in their trade and economic links with the West. I think Palestinians would try not to antagonize the US because they know that however much pressure they can try to bring through their fellow members of BRICS, it's essentially the United States that has the main say in trying to resolve or get a peace deal with Israel.
And have we heard about this from the Palestinian government at all? Because it's quite hard for them to reconcile closer ties with Russia, a country which has invaded a sovereign neighbour and committed war crimes in the past 2 years.
No, we haven't really heard very much. We've heard that the Palestinian ambassador in Moscow, Ambassador Nofal, has said that Vladimir Putin has promised there will be a session devoted to Palestine, but the Palestinians have been quite careful not to side with the Americans over the whole Ukraine war, but equally they haven't really openly supported Moscow on this. They've tried to stay neutral on this affair. But I think, yes, it would be awkward because they would be seen to be joining the Russian camp. But equally, the Brazilians, for example, who are a member of BRICS, one of the founding members, they are in BRICS. They have been from the start. That's the first B of the acronym. And they certainly don't want to be seen as condoning the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Now, they haven't changed the acronym yet, but Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran and the UAE all joined earlier this year. How has that gone and what has it actually done for them?
Hard to say. I mean, we don't really know what kind of economic help it may bring to them. And the aim, obviously, would be for them to boost trade among each other and give a sense of solidarity and negotiate perhaps collectively, but not individually with the United States and other Western groups over the terms of trade, which is what they want to group together for. I mean, that's the aim. Their political aim is a bit vaguer. They don't really have very much in common. They are quite disparate, both geographically and politically in their setup. And bringing in these other countries, especially Saudi Arabia and Egypt, which are closely tied to Western economies and to Western political establishments, would tend to rather dismiss the idea that they could be a kind of opposite pole to the West. They certainly could be an opposite economic pole, but not necessarily political.
And on that point, I mean, they've stated some grand ambitions for formalization at various points, even calling for a notional currency. But is this actually a legitimate club worth being in for the Palestinians and other nations?
Well, it's certainly politically helpful. It gives them strong political backing because the BRICS nations have expressed solidarity with Palestine. And as you said earlier, South Africa is one of those that has been most active, in fact, taking a case to the World Court on the Palestinian question. They have felt the need for others to be more visibly on side. Some Western nations have given support. Some recently have decided to recognize the Palestinian state, which they didn't beforehand. But any support they can get, obviously, will help their cause.
Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Specialist for The Times. Thank you very much. Still to come on the programme.
Where did you get the drugs? Talk. There's an art to this you may not realize.
What, they're just saying the same thing over and over?
Let's see your technique. I showed you my luggage card trick. Admit it. It's cool.
Okay, fine. It was very cool.
Brad Pitt and George Clooney reunite in Wolves, one of the films premiering in Venice this week. We'll check in with Karen Krasanovic, who's at the film festival. This is The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me in the studio is Inga Thorda, Chief External Relations Officer at the Ocean-Born Foundation and former Senior Editor at the BBC and CNN. Inga, welcome to the studio. What's caught your eye this morning?
Well, actually, Venezuela caught my eye. It's something that isn't covered very much here in the UK press, but the Globe and Mail had a good coverage of it with the protest yesterday. So basically, the background to this is it's now been a month since Maduro was declared winner, which obviously has been widely condemned, and the election is not seen as fair or transparent. Now, in the wake of that, opposition protests spread all over the country. But true to his playbook, Maduro cracked down very heavily on those protests. And since then, there have been arbitrary arrests, which in an operation which is informally known as Operation Knock Knock, a very sinister name given that it's knocking on the door each time. It's believed that around 2,000 people have been arrested so far, although official figures don't exist, and many of the NGOs are saying they're around 1,400. I think it's interesting that many of those people are facing very serious charges. It's not just sort of a protest or disobedience. It's actually charges like inciting hatred, terrorism, and are being handled by a special court. So despite this, yesterday the opposition took to the streets again, a month after the election, to highlight that that nothing has really been resolved. And I think that the interesting thing is Maria Machado, who was banned from standing in the election, did make an appearance.
And she's surrounded in these images. She's on a truck and she's surrounded by tens of thousands of people in the city centre. That's
right. But there were fewer people that attended these rallies than the original rallies, probably because of fear, because, the crackdown has been very brutal. But their key demand, and I think it's important that their key demand is about fairness and transparency. They believe they have the evidence that would show that their candidate, Edmundo González, who stood after Ms. Machado was banned, won by 2-1, if that was really revealed, which of course Maduro has refused to do.
And there were small protests of Venezuelans in other Latin American capitals. And we've seen this bit of a shift over the summer, haven't we, where, other left-wing governments across South America have sort of turned on the Venezuelan government now. And that's in part because they've had huge flows of Venezuelans out of the borders into their countries, haven't they?
That's true. And it's been interesting speaking to people in the region who are saying that wherever they go in Latin America, it doesn't matter which country, you will find Venezuelans asking for help, saying they need to leave. Either the ones that have managed to get out, asking for help and support, or those that are still trying to leave. So I think this is going to be a huge crisis in the LATAM region if it's not resolved. But interestingly, despite the widespread condemnation, there has been little action. And from what I can see in the papers, US, for example, doesn't seem to have an appetite for further sanctions on Venezuela. And the LATAM countries have so far not taken strong action, even if they haven't recognized the results. So there is still kind of action that needs to follow those strong words, I think.
And that US point is really interesting, isn't it? Because immigration is such a hot topic, dominates this election. And a lot of this movement is actually, there's a significant portion that are coming from Venezuela up through Mexico and across the border. Why do you think the US has been reluctant to go further on the country?
Well, it's difficult to say, and it will be interesting to say how the immigration sort of plays out in this election now. But obviously the US has, their interference in LATAM in the past hasn't always been very successful. And I mean, one of the solutions that are talked about with Venezuela is that it can only go in two directions, either the Nicaragua model, where it's complete autocracy, that sort of was almost born from the US interventions there, or the Romanian model, where there will be mass protests that will eventually force him out. But I think that what the US does could make a difference. But so far, and maybe for obvious reasons, they haven't acted.
Well, turning to somewhere normally a bit colder, but things are hotting up due to eruptions, Iceland, it's facing more troubles.
Yeah, well, yes and no, actually. It's interesting. I mean, so the papers in Iceland have been marking a week this time since the latest eruption began. This is the 5th eruption this year. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine when you're only in August that there's already been 5 volcanic eruptions in the country. But it's the 9th in the last 3 years. It's happening all in the same place. It's a very active volcanic area, although it has been in a slumber for 800 years. So it's been a long time. The good news this time is that it's further north, this specific eruption, so it's not threatening any infrastructure or people. unlike previous eruptions, which did cause a lot of trouble for a small fishing village. And obviously...
We saw the pictures earlier in the year of houses being engulfed in the lava.
Yeah, and pretty much everyone has moved away from that little town, Grindavik. And it's obviously very close to the Blue Lagoon. But I think that the sort of interesting thing that they're watching now is the sort of lava smoke. There's no sort of toxic rain or anything like that, but there's lava smoke that is flowing over. It doesn't smell very nice. And it has been felt as far as Spain and Madeira. So, it does travel depending on the wind. So they're keeping an eye on that. But so far, health authorities in Iceland are saying that it's perfectly within safe limits, so we should be okay.
And, it does sound like it's better than earlier in the year, but it does take a toll on the country in terms of infrastructure. And particularly as well, you've mentioned there, the Blue Lagoon, somewhere I've swam around. It's a great place to go on holiday. It's totally unique. But has it had an effect putting people off?
Well, I think during the eruption that happened just before Christmas, when which was pretty bad, and the lava flowed in the direction of the Blue Lagoon and Grindavik, there was definitely a lot of cancellations in Iceland. But I think that it's really important to say that, these eruptions are in a very small part of the country. They're in a very visible part of the country because you can see it as you fly into the country and on the way from the international airport to the capital. But it's actually not. I mean, the rest of the country is perfectly fine. And and the visuals from it are stunning. I mean, when you see a volcanic eruption, there's nothing like it. I mean, just the power of the earth kind of coming at you there. And some of the media there was showing some amazing images of the eruption with the northern lights dancing just above it.
Oh, wow.
I mean, you wouldn't see that anywhere else. So
that is quite
I think that if you have a chance in your lifetime to see an eruption that is safe, then you should definitely do that. Some people have not been very safe in trying to get close. I would not advise going close to an erupting volcano.
And my top tip for that is don't bother trying to photograph the Northern Lights because you need some pretty specialist settings on your camera and a nice camera to do it. Just take it in and enjoy it because it doesn't look like anything on a phone camera. But in the moment, it's incredible. And with some added lava, that would be great.
It really is. Yeah. And everything is open and so it's just an opportunity, I think, actually to see it. And the Blue Lagoon that did close for a while is back up, so people can go and swim.
Good. But you should actually go to the secret lagoon, which is even better, although it is a bit of a tricky drive.
There we go. There's some travel tips from Iceland.
Indeed, yeah. And turning now to Paris. Now, 33 days ago, I was standing on the banks of the Seine getting absolutely bloody soaked for the opening ceremony, but it was a glorious night last night for the Paralympians.
It really was. What a difference between those two opening ceremonies. I mean, Paris really put on its charm yesterday. It was, first clear blue skies for the flyovers and everything, and then this amazing sunset as a backdrop as the Paralympians walked down. And I mean, the review of it have been fantastic. Everyone's saying what a glorious night it was. And obviously it was the first time that the opening ceremony was taken out of the main stadium. So there was a lot at stake for the
Which
French
many felt
organisers.
didn't work. Outside of France, many people felt it didn't work on the river setting. But it seemed to work quite well on the Champs-Élysées, obviously glorious arcade in the city.
Absolutely. And I mean, maybe the weather did play a part in the Olympic ceremony. But I think it was an absolutely brilliant opening to the Games. Very long ceremony, though. I don't know how people felt sitting there for 3.5 hours. At least, as you say, there wasn't rain on there. But I think the Paralympic sort of movement is seeing this as a real kind of test. And you can see the comparisons with London, where, the Paralympics were really kind of taken into a different era in a way with the sort of campaigns that went around it, normalizing disability and showing, disability in a very different light, including making fun of it, which I think is important. And I think that there was an article in the Guardian this morning by Adi Adipidan, where he talks about whose responsibility is it really to kind of talk about social justice when it comes to disability, and he believes that the Paralympics has a large role to play in that. Although he makes it very clear that it shouldn't be on every Paralympian to deal with that. But I think that it is always this sort of question of like, do people need to teach do disabled people need to teach able people how to do things, similar to what you talk about in the feminist movement? Do women need to teach men? And I think that it's all of our responsibilities. And I think that it will be really interesting to see how many people turn up, but also how engaged they will be.
Yeah, and for any French listeners, I know a lot of Parisians and French people sort of fled Paris for the Olympics, and some of them tended to regret it, and they went back and tried to get tickets. Having been to the Paris Olympics, the atmosphere was absolutely fantastic. And 12 years ago at the London ones, went to a Paralympic and Olympic events. It is so good. If you are in and around Paris or in France, go and support the Paralympics. It is a fantastic movement, and you will have a great time. They are extraordinary athletes. Just finally, Heinz has launched canned carbonara for Gen Z. I can already hear Italian listeners screaming. What is this?
I think they probably should be screaming. It's interesting that Heinz seems to be taking their cue from social media on product development. So this is the second product that they've really developed, watching what Gen Z is arguing about on Reddit or TikTok. So they believe that the argument on Reddit around why isn't their carbonara happening the way it should is a good marketing ploy for them, and therefore they should put it out. They did it a couple of years, I believe, with the ketchup pickle, which came from a TikTok viral moment. And so, it is interesting. They claim that a large proportion, I think more than 30% of Gen Zs want their food to be convenient and easy. This is their response to that.
Okay.
We'll wait and see. Let's the Italian try and tell us.
Well, Inga, aside from, being caught in a nuclear winter and being forced to eat this, are you tempted at all to have canned carbonara?
I have to say, personally, I'm not, although I am a terrible cook, so I wouldn't be able to cook it like the Italians. But, I'll take my chances, though.
Inga Thorder, thank you very much. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. Telegram boss and founder Pavel Durov has been placed under formal investigation by prosecutors in France as part of a probe into organised crime on the messaging app. The Russian-born billionaire, who also holds French citizenship, has paid a €5 million deposit to be released on supervision. He's required to remain in France and report to a police station twice a week. At least 3 people were killed in southwestern Japan on Thursday as Typhoon Shanshan made landfall in Kagoshima Prefecture, bringing heavy rain and very strong winds, as well as snarling air traffic and knocking out the power to over 250,000 households. Major automakers, including Toyota and Nissan, suspended operations at some of their factories. The UK's new Labour government is planning to toughen measures on smoking, banning it in pub gardens, outdoor restaurants, outside hospitals, and on sporting grounds. Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer is also looking to resurrect his predecessor Rishi Sunak's plan of banning the sale of tobacco products to anyone born after 2009. And the Paralympic Games kicked off with a spectacular opening ceremony in Paris last night. Once again, escaping a stadium setting, thousands of athletes paraded along the Champs-Élysées to Place de la Concorde in glorious sunshine this time. Competition begins today and carries on for the next 2 weeks. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. To the Southern Hemisphere now, where Pacific Island leaders have backed an Australian-funded joint policing plan with 4 training centres to be established across the region. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's $400 million Australian plan ostensibly aims to create a multinational crisis reaction force. But could China's increasing activity in the area also be a motive? Joining me now from Brisbane is journalist and broadcaster Paul Osborne. Paul, thank you for coming on the show. Firstly, can you just explain how this force is intended to operate and who will be in it?
So it's called the Pacific Policing Initiative. It was agreed at this fairly regular event called the Pacific Islands Forum, which is a gathering of 18 nations, Australia the largest, New Zealand, and then 16 other nations from across the Pacific, among them countries like Palau, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Tonga. You mentioned Australia bankrolling $400 million as part of this plan. The idea behind the initiative is there'll be a training facility set up here in Brisbane, which will allow those smaller Pacific nations' police forces to kind of hook into the resources of the Australian Federal Police. And what will then happen is there will be this Pacific Police Support Group, which in theory could be deployed across the wider region to those countries to deal with things like disasters, big security challenges. There's a real concern in some of these smaller island nations about international crime, about criminal gangs using those places as jumping off points to try and get, for example, drugs into major countries like Australia and New Zealand. And so it's a regional thing driven, funded by Australia, welcomed largely but not entirely by those other countries. They are free to decide whether to accept those forces and how big a role to play in it. There's the geopolitical issue too, which is that Australia would rather those countries sign a deal with them than, say, with China.
And the region is geographically far from its allies on other continents. Is it a good idea to build this sort of mutual assistance?
Well, Australia has always seen itself as the leader in that Pacific region, as providing stability there. There are other things that are being discussed at this forum. There's a particular issue around climate change where Australia is stepping in and offering guarantees to some places. The issue for Australia was that a number of these countries are now being courted by other powers. The United States, under Barack Obama, switched its focus to the Asia-Pacific region as a way of trying to counter China. And China, indeed, has been busily trying to build its own influence in the region. Just before Christmas last year, they invited representatives from a number of Pacific police forces to attend a meeting in Beijing, which Australia watched with some interest. And one analyst talking about this deal said, if you want the Americans or the Australians to pay for something in the Pacific, the easiest way to do that is to tell them that you're also talking to China about it. And so there is nothing in this deal that precludes countries going and signing different agreements with China, but the expectation is that they would rely on this Pacific Police Support Group, led and largely funded by Australia instead.
And, there is a complicated history with the big neighbours, New Zealand and Australia, for Pacific Islanders. But is this a good way of trying to reset relations, not just to fend off China, but to sort of reset relations and build a better alliance?
Well, again, in an increasingly contested region with more global superpowers wanting to exert more influence in the region, there was always that danger that Australia would find itself squeezed out. A couple of years ago, it signed up to the AUKUS deal for nuclear submarine technology with the United States and the United Kingdom as a way of anchoring itself to that alliance. But now it needs to also strengthen the relationship it has with these different smaller island nations in the Pacific. It seems to be working. The Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, James Marape, said that Australia is its security partner of choice, though interestingly, he did also say that was at the moment, and keeping his options open. In the past, he has said he wants Papua New Guinea to be a friend to all and enemy to none, and that phrase has been used to facilitate talks with China. Now, to what extent individual nations in the Pacific would be willing to entrust, for example, their security to a nation like China or even the United States, given the political instability in that country at the moment, the uncertainty surrounding the election result, is unclear. But obviously it does provide leverage to get more support out of Australia.
And the leaders of Fiji, Palau, Papua New Guinea and Tonga were flanking Albanese at the Pacific Islands Forum when this announcement was being made. But the Solomon Islands signed a secret security pact with China in 2022. How much do we know about that? What was the trade-off there?
Well, it's never entirely clear what the trade-off is in those agreements with China. This is not the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not where China comes in and gives you huge amounts of money for big infrastructure projects, in return for a series of guarantees. But what China wants is it wants open access for trade, and it also does want to expand its role and its position in the wider Pacific region. And that's where Australia and New Zealand sense that things could be slipping away from them. So that example of the Solomon Islands, the issues around Papua New Guinea being open to talks with China, the fact that China was sort of sniffing around the region, trying to strike these deals with individual nations was probably a fundamental part of what drove Australia to make this very big financial commitment, this $400 million commitment to this plan. And Australia wants to take that further. this policing plan is largely in response to issues around crime and terrorism and things like that. But there's the big security threat in the region is climate change. Now, last year, Australia and Tuvalu signed an agreement which legally binds Australia to aid Tuvalu in the event of a natural disaster or military attack. But the big issue for Tuvalu, it's only 10 square miles. Most of it's less than 2 meters above sea level. It's going to be one of the first places to be properly impacted by climate change. Australia has stepped in, and from this year, we'll be giving hundreds of visas to people to come from Tuvalu to Australia. But it all links back to security in the end, because in return for those guarantees of support in the event of climate-related problems or other natural disaster, Australia now has the right to veto Tuvalu from forming any security cooperation pact with any other country. In the end, it all comes back to that battle for influence.
Quite a chessboard in the Pacific region. Well, Paul Osborne, thank you. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, the annual GlobeSec Forum on Foreign Policy, Security, European Affairs and Economy begins tomorrow in Prague, attended by the Monocle team who depart today. Monocle senior news editor Chris Chermak sat down with Monocle's host of the Foreign Desk, Andrew Muller, to look ahead to the team's coverage of the forum.
Andrew Muller, Monocle's contributing editor, here with me in the Midori House studio. Just before, Andrew, we set off for Prague for this year's GlobeSec, and I wanted to start with the very simple question that will be on, well, every listener's mind who has not perhaps listened to previous years. What is GlobeSec?
It's a pretty big whoop. It's the Global Security Conference, and it's been, I guess, one of the premier European security, strategic diplomacy, military conferences for some time. I guess an Eastern European analogue to something like the Munich Security Conference. It has, until this year, been held in Bratislava, in neighbouring Slovakia. There does seem to have been some sort of rift between Slovakia's somewhat rambunctious government and GlobeSec, however. So this year instead, having been to the last two in Bratislava, we're going to Prague.
Before we get to the last two, I was curious about that. Do we know anything more? Are the reasons somewhat overt or not overt about why this year we are going to Prague instead of Bratislava, which is the headquarters of GlobeSec?
It still is the headquarters of GlobeSec. The reasons for the relocation, I believe, are slightly more covert than overt, though it is generally assumed that there has been some sort of falling out, because it does seem like an extraordinary thing for Slovakia to pass up, even if you are Prime Minister Robert Fico and you have no time for these sinister globalist elitist types. The injection of money that it must bring once a year to Bratislava is unfathomable, to say nothing of the prestige endowed by, fairly serious people who do turn up at these things.
Well, and you are a grizzled veteran of these yourself, Andrew. This will be my first time, so I'll be relying on your expertise in Prague. What has it been like for you the past few years? What did you learn? It's
been really good for us. We have struck up, as Monocle Radio, a really good relationship with the organisers at GlobeSec, who are extremely accommodating and extremely helpful, and it's been a really rewarding partnership, and I think we've managed to make some really good programs in previous years. The benefit of GlobeSec, like the benefit of any one of these big wingdings, is that you just have a lot of serious people, office holders, former office holders, doubtless future office holders, gathered in one place. So, I mean, as you will know from producing the show, Chris, it can in sometimes take days, weeks to arrange an interview with one such personage, but at a thing like this, you can sweep up dozens of them in 72 somewhat frantic hours.
There are prime ministers, presidents, former prime ministers and presidents, foreign ministers, and many more. Who are you most excited about yourself, Andrew? You're also going to be moderating a few panels.
I am moderating two panels at last count, one on the future of Black Sea security and one on what is actually occurring in Ukraine. And quite excitingly on that panel, former Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov is appearing, at least as of the most recent email I received on the subject. I think, as is the case with all these conferences, they can be somewhat movable feasts. That will be fun. In terms of other guests, so Chris, really, you tell me.
Oh, you're going to throw this back at me, are you? Well, I will say, keeping with that theme of rotating panels, we have a similar rotating cast of possible interviewees. We will be interviewing the Czech Republic's foreign minister, which will be interesting as the hosts, as well as a various cast of former presidents. Kersti Kaljulaid will be there as one example from Estonia. We are working on plenty. We have lots of defense types for you, Andrew. Various generals, former generals from France, from Poland, and from the United States. And I think that does speak maybe to one topic, could we say, of this year's GlobeSec. Just defense seems to be playing a big role in just the question of defense integration in Europe. We'll also be speaking with Yuri Sidivi, who's the head of the European Defence Agency, for example. A lot of those kinds of people are there in addition to the politicians. Does that tell you anything?
It tells us that there's been some recurrent themes in GlobeSec of the last few years. The first one we went to in 2022, yes, it must have been, was of course a matter of months after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and given that that was literally the country next door to Slovakia, that did rather dominate proceedings. But GlobeSec, because of where it is and because of who goes, I think it has been one of the preeminent forum in which leaders and former leaders and aspiring leaders from Eastern Europe have sat down with their Western European counterparts and said, will somebody please listen to us? We have been trying to tell you since the end of the Cold War what Russia is, and you have not been listening to us, and now look at where we are. And this has escalated over the last few years, and we are going to hear it again, I am sure, this year. But the defence aspect of it is going to become increasingly important, because at this point, nobody thinks this war is going to end tomorrow. Regrettably, no one thinks it's going to end next week or next month, possibly not even next year. Everybody, I think, at this point understands that Europe needs to think about defence differently and more seriously, and factoring in not just what is going on to the east, but what is going on further west, it being far from impossible that the US will re-elect Donald Trump, who clearly could not care less about any of this.
Well, we will find out just how much the West has learned from the East at this year's GlobeSec in Prague. Much more on Monocle Radio to come. Thank you, Andrew.
Chris Chermak and Andrew Miller there. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Well, it's 9:47 in Istanbul, 8:47 in Zurich. It's time for a roundup of stories from the Middle East and North Africa. Joining me now is Ruth Michelson, journalist and Middle East correspondent. Ruth, what's caught your eye this morning?
Well, the first thing that we're seeing, and it's probably worth saying, this is unfolding across a lot of different live blogs, seeing this on the Al Jazeera live blog, the one from The National, which is a news outlet based in the UAE, talking about a major Israeli incursion into 3 cities in the West Bank. which is now continuing into its second day. So this is in Tulkarem, Jenin, and Tubas. And so, we're seeing rather disparate reports about the number of people that have been killed since these dawn raids started yesterday morning, anywhere between 12 or as many as 19 people. And Al Jazeera reporting that Joseph Borrell from the EU saying that this major military incursion by Israel into the occupied West Bank must not be the premises of an extension of the war in Gaza.
And I mean, how significant is this in context? Because obviously the West Bank has been an area of tension for a long time. But does this feel like a significant escalation?
I mean, I think that's definitely what we're seeing from the reporting. There's definitely some alarm. I mean, New York Times reporting about panic in Jenin among the residents because of the size of the escalation. The New York Times opening its reporting on this, talking about the West Bank as a growing third front in a conflict that extends from the Egyptian border with the Gaza Strip all the way into southern Lebanon. So I think there's real fear that the size of this escalation, the continuation of it, and also statements by, for example, the Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz saying that Israel will use, in his words, the same determination used against terror infrastructure in Gaza in this fight. And that also includes what he said was the temporary evacuation of Palestinian residents from these cities. And so that is a major shift in terms of the nature, the scale of the Israeli operations in the West Bank.
Now shifting to the Red Sea, a Greek-flagged oil tanker which was attacked is now leaking oil. It's still on fire days after Houthi militants struck it.
Yes, so this is the Suyunion. It was attacked by Houthi militants last week. They have been, in relation to what we just spoke about, they have been attacking these tankers in the Red Sea because of Israeli attacks on Gaza. They say they're attacking in response. This tanker of crude oil, Greek flagged, it is apparently still on fire. There are reports this morning from Al Jazeera that the Houthis may now allow rescue vessels to get close to the ship, but it's leaking oil. And this is where fears come in. We're seeing from US officials, spokesman from the Pentagon Air Force, Patrick Ryder, saying yesterday that the flag is leaking oil, that there are fears that if there were to be an oil spill linked to the ship, it could be something 4 times the amount of the notorious 1989 Exxon Valdez disaster, just because of the amount of oil on board.
And turning to Iran now, the Supreme Leader has opened the doors for renewed negotiations on their nuclear program with the United States.
Yes, so this is Ayatollah Ali Khamenei earlier this week, saying on state television that there was no harm in engaging with the enemy, in his words. So obviously sending the signal that Iran is willing to conduct renewed negotiations over its nuclear program with the US. And then we saw pretty quickly that US officials came out and said that they're not really willing to discuss renewed talks, at least not direct talks. There are indirect talks happening, as reported by the New York Times. State Department spokesman quoted in ABC News saying, "We will judge Iran's leadership by their actions and not their words."
And finally, the US military has been taking to Tinder, but it's not for thirst traps.
Yes, exactly. Not exactly the kind of message that you would expect to see on opening Tinder, apparently, if you open it in Lebanon right now. But it is a warning posted by US Central Command with pictures of US warplanes. So, yeah, not a thirst trap there, saying do not take arms against the United States or its partners, mentioning that America is willing to protect its partners in the region. And so obviously this is raising some eyebrows that they chose to post this on Tinder. A journalist that spotted this said he noticed that if he swiped right, it redirected him to a post by the US military saying with a similar message on X or Twitter. But I think, the real conclusion here, or the real level of analysis, came from Timothy Caldas from the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, who saw this and reacted and said by saying, who on earth approved this and how high was everyone in their chain of command?
Well, I mean, it does, nations have tried to get messages out. They've done airdrops of flyers. They've, put things on the radio and stuff. It does seem like the modern way that you'd connect with particularly younger people who might be minded to take up arms.
Well, I mean, if we're thinking about what someone's using Tinder for, is this really going to connect and convince them at that particular time? Yes, Arab News, Saudi Arabian outlet, calling this a unique move. It is a unique move because are you reaching that audience? Is somebody going to say, you know what, I think I'm going to call off my idea of attacking the United States or its partners because I saw this message on Tinder?
Ruth Michelson, thank you very much. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's show, the 81st annual Venice International Film Festival is underway as of today. And joining me now from the Italian city is film critic Karen Krasanovic. Karen, welcome to the show. Bring us some of the atmosphere there. What's it like?
It's very, very warm. Everybody's dressed beautifully, and it's very calm, but it's also got an air of excitement. The big stars haven't really come in, although that's a bit of a misnomer because Sigourney Weaver was given an honorary Golden Lion yesterday, which was quite remarkable. But the hubbub is starting to increase. We're starting to get more people and more red carpets. So we're only third day into the festival. But I have to say, it's like Cannes, but less frenetic. Mm-hmm. There's an ease about it along with the glamour, which is really nice.
And give us a preview. Who are the big stars coming and what are their big films this year?
Oh my gosh. We had the opener, of course, was Beetlejuice. And we had some of the story. We had Jenny Ortega in last night. Last night, I was watching Disclaimer with Kate Blanchett. That's under an embargo. I can't talk about it, but that's Alfonso Cuarón's 7-part series. And she sat in front of me in the plane, actually. So she was here as well.
Wow.
And we've got George, very nice person. We've got George Clooney and Brad Pitt reuniting with wolves. And we've also got Daniel Craig in Luca Guadagnino's Queer, which will also be showing.
I just wanted to mention, the reuniting of Clooney and Pitt. They obviously did the Ocean's films together. What's their new vehicle?
Well, the new one is Wolves. It's supposed to be very, very silly. It's by John Watts. And everybody's looking forward to it because we don't really expect it to be particularly... Well, it's a comedy, first of all, and it's got Amy Ryan and also Austin Abrams in it, and it's about two professionals who prefer to work alone, but they find themselves paired together. It's one of those goofy ones, Okay. But I think it's going to be great fun.
So not troubling any award ceremonies in a couple of months' time, but something that might be a big blockbuster, Joker Folie à Deux. Now, the first one earned Joaquin Phoenix an Oscar for his portrayal of Joker. Could the sequel earn one for Lady Gaga as Harley Quinn?
We'll have to see. I mean, it is a musical, don't forget. And also this is showing the second week of the festival, saying according to the availability of the stars. Well, sometimes stuff in the later part of the festival is, you're just a little bit questionable. But I think it's going to be exciting. And what's really amazing about this particular festival, this year, it seems to be a real balance of art house and commercial. There's a lot of films here that I'm really eager to see, and that's unusual.
And you mentioned Queer, which stars Daniel Craig. It will be a big departure from James Bond. It's directed by Luca Guadagnino, who previously helmed Call Me By Your Name and the excellent Challengers, which came out earlier this year. It's been cut down in length twice, though, and still can't find a distributor.
Yes, well, this film has been finished, from what I understand, for a couple of years. In fact, I think it was finished before Challengers, and Challengers was supposed to open the festival last year, but didn't. Apparently, Daniel Craig is amazing in it. I've spoken to people who have seen it already, and they said it's an absolute knockout. Now, cutting it down is always a director's problem. And not being able to find a distributor, well, the same thing happened to Megalopolis. I'm sure someone will snap it up.
And in terms of the Oscar race, I mean, is this it all kicking off now? Who's generating the buzz? And what did Sigourney Weaver actually get her Lion for?
Well, she got her Lion for honorary life achievement. So, I mean, that's her entire life. There was a lot of talk of Working Girls and Gorillas in the Mist, and of course, Alien with Alien Romulus. Sort of, she was, without her, we wouldn't have the whole franchise. So, I think that now more than ever, Venice is the first glittering European kickoff for what the Oscars will be next year. It's a little bit early to say who yet because we haven't seen enough, but I think there's going to be at least a couple nominees here.
Well, Karen Krzanovich, thank you very much. Enjoy Venice over the next few days. And that's all for today's programme. Thanks to our producers, Laura Kramer, Tom Webb and Anita Riota, our researcher, Sana Jumani, and our studio manager, Flynn Simmons. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday London time. The Globalist returns at the same time tomorrow with me, Vincent McAviney. If you've enjoyed the podcast, please do subscribe and leave us a review. Let us know what you've enjoyed listening to and what you would like to hear more of. Thank you for tuning in.